Welcome to this episode of 22nd Century Management with Ken. Whether you're watching on the YouTube video or you're listening to the podcast, if you haven't already done so, do me a favor. Please go ahead and follow me or subscribe to the channel, hit the notify icon. Also, if you would, hit the like button if you're watching on YouTube. That way, YouTube knows there's value here and they'll share it with others. Today's guest is Richard Stone. And for the past 30 years, Richard has been assisting organizations across the country to tell their story better. As CEO of Storywork International, he's been pioneering new approaches to bring the practical applications of storytelling into all facets of business, healthcare, education, and society. So, Richard, I gave you a little bit of an introduction. You want to tell us some more about you?
Thanks so much for having me on, Ken, and it's great to be here with you. Well, it's funny, I always tell people that you have to be careful who you get on an airplane with and who you sit next to because they can change your life. And about maybe 31, 32 years ago, I was flying back from a backpacking trip out west, and there were a couple of backpackers sitting next to me, and we were talking about this trail and that, and at some point they said, "Have you ever been to the National Storytelling Festival?" And I said, "What's that? I've never heard of such a thing. What are you talking about?" And so I got to know them after we got back. I was living in Orlando, Florida at the time, and ended up going with them to the festival and had an epiphany as I sat there in the audience listening to a guy named Michael Cotter, who was a farmer from Minnesota, a third generation farmer, telling simple stories of growing up on the land and the things he had seen and witnessed and the changes he had observed over the years since he took over the farm from his father. And so I've been sort of plowing land myself over the last 30 years, looking at ways to use storytelling in a very applied way to help leaders become more effective and organizations to better reach their goals. So that's been pretty much all the work. There have been a few little detours in there. Worked with a small company that used to be part of the Disney organization called Ideas that was on the backlot of MGM Studios in Orlando for a few years as their story analytics master, which was the best title, I think, in the universe. But over the last few years, I've been working with my business partner, Scott Livengood, who lives in Winston-Salem. I live in the Atlanta area now. And we have been developing new models for transformation using the power of story.
Well, very nice. And it's interesting, as I was mentioning before we started, that I'm a huge fan of stories, and maybe I'll tell a story about how I use stories during our discussion today. But let me start off with what is story intelligence. I've heard of emotional intelligence, and I've heard of obviously intelligence. And so what is story intelligence?
You know, these are all concepts or constructs that people thought up. The notion of intellectual intelligence was a new idea in the early 1900s, and someone devised a test for trying to assess that. And for a long time, we thought that IQ was kind of a fixed thing. You know, you got your number and that's what it was, but it turns out that's also not true. Then in the late 1980s and early 1990s, a lot of research was being done on the power of emotions, and this sort of new idea was emerging around emotional intelligence, that it's our emotions and our ability to connect to people and read ourselves emotionally that had a lot more to do with success than your intellect and how smart you were. And then over the last 15 years, there's been a new body of research coming out, and people have been looking at how our brain's wired. And it turns out our brain is wired for story. And it is so integral to who we are. We think that we have a thing that we call story intelligence, and that it pervades every facet of our being. It pervades our relationships. It pervades the way we see ourselves and the world and others. And it's something that we can also enhance because we think it's part of what we would call our native language. So this is an idea. It's a fairly new idea, a relatively new idea. And as part of that, we've conceived of 7 powers of story that we need to master to really amplify our story intelligence. And it's not that it's better than emotional intelligence. We think it actually amplifies your emotional intelligence. I think it makes you smarter, more aware of the world and your circumstances. So I think it could also enhance your intellect as well.
Okay, well, very good. What gave you the idea for the concept of story intelligence?
Well, we've been looking at this idea for some years now. And like often, many good ideas happen over a glass of wine and dinner. And one night I was sitting with Scott in Winston-Salem, and I was saying, if there were different powers of story, what would they be? And we began musing about that and thinking about how story is so integral to our lives. And at the time, we came up with 7. They've been a little altered since we first began that conversation. But the first is to transport. And we know that stories can take us someplace else and to another place in time. They can take us in the past. They can take us to the future, or that we can walk in another person's shoes through stories. So stories do that. And then there's some more fundamental things like communication, which you're very aware of, is that we're all talking all the time. And it turns out that we are much more effective when we're telling stories than we are just conveying information or facts. And there's a lot of data on that that demonstrates how our brain works and why it works that way. I think it also enables learning. That's the third power, that we can learn better through the power of story. And native peoples have known that forever. They have used stories as an integral part of the way they raised children. The fourth is to create meaning. And I think in past times, we had sort of what I would call meta narratives, big stories about our place in the world. And those aren't as effective anymore for helping us figure out what it means to be a human being, and especially in the 21st century. So that's the fourth one. So let me pause there and see if you got any questions about those. And there's three more. Maybe we can get to those when we have time.
Okay, I don't really have any questions on those right now, but those all fascinate me. I will say that you talked about the use of stories, and when I teach class and when I speak, almost always I have to tell stories to illustrate my point. And I love your comment about that's the way in the past people learned skills, and everything had to do with the stories that they heard, and they would listen to stories while they were being trained on things. So I think that's an interesting insight. Give me
Stories
the next
embed
three.
things in our brain in a way that just giving information doesn't. They stick. You're in a classroom teaching somebody something, and you tell that story. You can see them 5 years later, and you say, Mr. Edmonds, I remember when you told that story about that. They'll remember that. They may not remember anything else you said, but they'll remember that.
I agree 100%. So you said you had three more for us.
Yeah, so the other three are the power. Well, let me say a little bit about create meaning also. Life is, in any one moment, there's millions of inputs. We're having all kinds of things go on. The question is, how do we make sense of it all? And so partly we have to choose. We have to select. We selectively perceive things and ignore other things. And we also interpret their meaning for them and for us. And many of the people who are listening today, if you've ever gotten together with a sibling and you're reminiscing about something that happened when you were kids, and you go, hey, you remember when dad blah blah blah, blah did what's, and they say, oh, no, that's not what happened. You must, I don't know where your head was, but let me tell you exactly what happened. And, unfortunately, we don't have a video camera in the sky where we can go back and observe it. And even then, I'm not sure that would be useful. So we're always constructing meaning, and, something that might be really significant for me may not be significant for you. And so stories help us create a sense of coherence. They help us have a sense that there's a past, a present, and a future. We can see that there's a through line, and that the experiences we had yesterday connect to the experiences we're going to have tomorrow. They're not just all random. The fifth power is to transform. And we can use stories to transform the past and also to transform our organizations. We often think that the past is something that's fixed. Well, that happened. I can't do anything about it. Well, our relationship with that event can change. The story we tell about that event also can be shifted. And the way we tell that story can either create a great deal of suffering or it can free us. So there are tools for doing that. And likewise, organizations have used stories to transform not just the organizations, but I've been working with an organization in New York City, PCI Media, that's been using stories to transform whole communities and change behavior and attitudes and whole cultures. So stories can be very transformative. The sixth is to unite. And what stories do is that they do two things. One is that stories can disconnect us. We're seeing a lot of evidence for that today, right? So they can disconnect us, but we can use the power of story to bring us together. Knowing how to do that, I think, becomes really important today. And then the last one is to envision possibilities. We often think of story as something retrospective, like it happened in the past, but actually all the brain mechanisms that are there for remembering something are also used for imagining and envisioning. And so the better we can tell stories, the better we can hone our story intelligence, the better we can be at imagining an alternate future and realizing that. So it becomes a really important tool, especially today.
And that's interesting. So that makes me question sometimes, because I see people that are trapped in kind of like they've already pre-written their story going forward, and they're not opening to looking at the possibilities around them. But that's kind of an aside. But it just dawned on me that maybe they just decide their story is already written and they're not showing any creativity to making a different story.
Well, it's an interesting question. We can get stuck on a story about the past and keep telling it the same way over and over again. And there's a little ditty that actually got a lot of truth to it. A guy named Donald Hebb, who was a neuropsychologist and a physiologist, says that neurons that fire together wire together. And there's some good things about that. We develop patterns, neural patterns. So you don't have to think about while you're brushing teeth. You can also read a book and do other things while you're doing it because you're on automatic pilot, right? You don't have to think about when you're getting out of bed, where do I put my feet? You're on automatic pilot for that. So there's great benefit in that. But the downside of that is we can tell a story to ourselves about something that happened in the past, and it gets wired in, and it's like in a loop. We all have those loops. Like, God, that's tape number 14 I'm playing every time I get together with my family, and it doesn't feel good. And I've got this story about them, and they got this story about me. And those stories get wired in. And so we have an opportunity to, one, examine those and say, is that story useful to me? Is it still serving me? Maybe I could tell a different story that might be better for me. I'll give you a quick example. This is a personal example for me. Years ago, I was asked to come and tell some stories at a Christmas event. I was down in Orlando as part of the Storytelling Association down there. And I'm Jewish. So, I thought, but it turned out I do have a story about Christmas. And it was about Dr. McCloskey and my best friend Paul across the street and how they used to recreate the whole nativity scene and Santa Claus coming in. It was a big deal. And I had always come over to help. And, my dad was not somebody who ever gave me a lot of praise. It just wasn't his way. I was somebody who was expected to do well. But there was part of that whole story was that Dr. McCloskey would always say, hey, good job, boys. And he would really give me a lot of encouragement. And I told that story more and more and more times. I told it many times. And I think even as an adult, every time I go visit my dad who lived in Tampa, I was still waiting for my dad to go, great job, Rick. But something shifted in the telling of that story many times. I gave to myself through the story what I've been looking for my dad for all those years. And at some point, I didn't need it from him anymore. And it freed me up to be with him and to be more loving and not be waiting around for him to demonstrate his affection or appreciation. So interesting.
Yeah, that is. Okay, so let me ask this question then. How can story intelligence help us in our business endeavors? You just talked about family, but how do we make it work for us in business?
Absolutely. So first of all, anyone who runs a business, owns a business, works in a business, you need to understand there is already a story going on right now. And people in your organization have a story about what the business is about. Your customers have a story about you. And the question is, do you want to be more intentional about that? So we have a belief that every organization should have what we would call a master story, which is a core story that really embodies its purpose and significance in the world. And when you have that, we think something profound can happen. One, the people who work with you, who work in the organization, now have something to aspire to. And it has to be aspirational. It can't be, well, we're in the business just to make some money. And I tell you, that story won't play very well today, especially with younger people. They want a sense of purpose. So that's part of that. And the other piece is to help each individual in the organization discover their own personal master story. What are they called to be doing here in the world? And so there's a model we have. The typical model you have, and you see it all around in business publications, put your values up on the wall and you can get posters that embody the values and you can plaster those all around. I once years ago was working with Eastman Chemical Company in Eastern Tennessee. They had their values and everywhere you went, they were on the wall everywhere. But if you asked anybody, what are the values around here? Nobody could tell you what they were. So our model is we try to get people to say, hey, this is our mission and vision as the organization. Everybody align with this. And we think that the new model is our deep purpose. This is our master story. What's your master story and how does it integrate with our organization's master story? So we're all growing together to achieve something big. And we think that's more inspiring and actually more engaging for staff. Because the Gallup numbers, they haven't changed much over the last years. Only about 30% of people are engaged, really engaged with their work. So that's a frightening number, that 70% of people come to work every day and they don't really want to be there. And so how do we create an environment where people are engaged? And we know when you can up that number, productivity goes up, people leaving the organization, the numbers go down. So it can be significant.
Yeah, I would agree 100% with that. Okay, so how can we use story intelligence then to give our lives new meaning?
Well, that's good. So there are different kinds of reminiscence that are important, I think, in life. Some of it's just simple reminiscence, just sitting around telling good times, talking about the good times. But even that has great value. We did a project a few years ago with Novant Health in North Carolina, created a program called Living Stories. And the idea behind this was to train volunteers to go in and spend time with patients to elicit their story. And they were interested in two kinds of stories, because they found that when people told positive stories, recollected positive events of their life, that it actually had a huge impact on their anxiety. It reduced their anxiety. Another kind of story that they would elicit is what we would call instrumental reminiscence. And what that's all about is remembering a time in the past when something where you faced a challenge and succeeded in getting through it. And just the remembering of that can actually help you in the present facing a current challenge. And it doesn't have to be a health challenge. It could be a story about the first time you learned how to ride a bicycle or whatever it was. And just the recollection of that can actually empower you in the present. And so we found in the research that anxiety levels went down, and also the probability that they would recover faster went up, according to some of the assessments. So those two are very important. The other two that are really important, I think, for all of us, one is what I would call transmissive reminiscence, which is sharing stories to share what we've learned with the next generation. And that becomes more important as we get a little grayer hair like you and I, as we have children and grandchildren in our lives. And the telling of stories, you were just telling me before we started about your granddaughter calling you, and you were telling a story about your son when you were in Mexico. And those stories, it turns out that intergenerational reminiscence or narratives, there's research being done right here at Emory in Atlanta by two psychologists, Robin Fivush and Marshall Duke, that just children hearing those stories actually increases their resilience and their self-esteem. And that's pretty powerful stuff. So just your spending time to share those stories, and it doesn't have to be in a formal setting. It could be while you're cutting up vegetables for dinner or whatever. And sometimes we don't think the kids are listening, but they're listening. They're paying attention. And those stories have a huge impact on them, because kids are born into a family and there's no story. They don't have a story. they're born into a story that's already left the station, in a sense. And they model themselves after the stories they hear. So hearing stories about when we as a family or a parent had difficulty but were able to get through it, they ingest that story and it becomes a model for them about how they can face challenges. The last one, Ken, has to do with what I would call integrative reminiscence. It's about, if you think of our life as a book and it's got chapters in it, how do we make sure that we include everything in the book, even the tough stuff, the things that were maybe difficult? Because often those tough experiences were the things that actually gave us the most growth. So how do we integrate all of that together? And I think that becomes a more important task as we get older, to make sense of our life. What has this journey meant? Here we are. We've lived I'm almost 70 myself. So here I am, I'm 69 years old, turned soon 70. And okay, what's this been about? Has it just been a random kind of journey, or has there been something more meaningful here that's been important?
Okay, and that makes a lot of sense. It's kind of interesting you talked about intergenerational, because some of the stories I told my granddaughter were stories of my grandfather. So that would have been her great-great-grandfather. And you imagine now she'll have that little piece of a story that will be part of the fabric of her life as well.
That's right. And that story becomes part of her. She'll have that story. She's never met your father, but through the story, she now knows him. And now she has a sense of continuity, that her life has something that goes back generations. And, Americans, we're kind of rare birds. Most Americans, if you said, can you tell me stories about 2 or 3 generations ago? We're lost. We don't even know the names of our forebears, hardly. So that becomes something really important, to have a sense that I have a place in history, and that these people went through these things, and maybe they immigrated here 100 years ago or whatever, and went through very difficult times to finally get here. And that becomes part of my own personal story. And those stories are crucial and important. Yeah.
Okay. So how can we then distinguish between stories that enrich us versus those that seek to divide us and make us hate each other?
That's such an important question for today. And we're wired probably to distrust strangers. For thousands of years, we lived in very tribal kind of settings, and people who were different from us could be murderous or rapacious, or could want our lands and our food. And so we learned early on that we had to be very careful with people who were different from us. But we live in a society that is a multi-ethnic society. And it turns out if you live in the city and you live with people who are from parts, suddenly it's actually quite enriching, you know. But if you live in rural areas and you've never seen somebody from Somalia or from Syria or someplace else, they're strangers and they're from afar. And we are susceptible, and we hear stories about those people. Those stories affect us, and we take them in to be the truth. So we have to, one, break through that and be willing to be curious and generous and hear the stories of others. And so once you've heard someone's story, they're not so different from us, even though they may have a different color skin, they may dress differently, they may come from a different culture. You start to find that we have more in common than we have that's different. And what happens is the media today loves propagating and reinforcing stories about the differences. And it's not useful, I think, for people, because we would be much better off hearing stories about similarities. And when we do, it opens our heart a little more, and we become more compassionate and more open to learning and to be curious about people who are different.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things I've been fortunate in my life, that I've traveled a lot. And I think that travel causes you to view people that are different from you in a much more favorable light.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And if you've seen different cultures, you've experienced kind of a culture shock if you go someplace else and you hardly speak the language and you see how hard it is to get around. And I've done that a few times in my life. I lived in Spain a couple times and lived with a family. And yeah, so travel gets us out of this very narrow way of seeing ourselves in the world and thinking that America is the only place in the world where the people have anything to offer. Well, there are rich cultures all over the world, and they have a lot to offer and teach us.
Yeah, I would agree 100% with that. So, how can we cultivate our story intelligence then?
Well, I think there's a few steps that are really crucial with developing story intelligence. There's one piece of that actually, which we don't think of, is story listening. How do we become better listeners? And so there's a skill to listening well. And the more we can listen well to others, I think the more we can extend and expand our consciousness and awareness. But the other is each of these powers has particular skill sets associated with them. So, for example, the power to transform. So, learning how to take a difficult experience and work with it in a way that it's not sitting on top of you, but that you can actually just see it as a story. So, there's a concept, it's called self distance. I knew a storyteller named Sid Lieberman, who's unfortunately not alive any longer. He said that seeing our life with a little bit of sense of humor is like seeing our life from the other side of the street. So, how do we begin to develop a little sense of distance from our experiences so that we don't take ourselves so seriously? The other thing is to look at the kinds of stories we're ingesting. So we have to become much more discriminate and much better consumers of stories, and to ask the question always, where did this story come from? Who's telling the story? What is their agenda? Do they have an agenda for telling the story this way? What actually happened here? I wonder if there's a different story, a different way of looking at this. So we don't get ourselves stuck in one point of view, which can be very narrow and can be very dangerous, actually. Yeah. So those are just a few of the things that I look for when I am talking to people. And we have workshops that we offer. I just finished a 7-week workshop, and we did an hour and a half each week on each of the powers, on how do you really evolve your skills in each of those. Even like envisioning possibilities, you can spend time developing your imaginal skills to start imagining with greater detail the future. There's a wonderful study that was done with students. And with one group of students, they said, we'd like you to imagine getting an A in this class. So they imagined at the end of the class, the teacher handing them their final grade, and it was an A. And the other group, they said, I want you to imagine the process you would have to go through to get an A. And it turned out that their performance was far higher than the ones who just imagined the A. So if you just kind of transpose that into any kind of task, any type of performance that you have to do, the more we can begin to imagine the detail and the steps, the more likely we're actually going to be able to fulfill those. So those are some really, I think, just simple examples.
I think that's a really good example. And I can see that for business leaders in particular, where they're in a business that there might be a need to make some transformation. If you start to think through the process and you start to imagine your business changing and what needs to be done to get you there, I can see where that would make it much easier to start down that road.
Yeah.
Whereas if you can't imagine it, then you don't change.
Yeah, I have a colleague who's big in innovation, DP Prakash, and DP. We've been having lots of conversations about this issue. And he says, like at Amazon, with any kind of project they're doing, the project leader, when they're starting the project, has to write a press release detailing their successes as though it's already happened. And then that's shared out with the team. So that creates a powerful picture for them that even though they may have a daunting task, they may have difficulties and things that they're trying that maybe they've never done before, they're having to have some breakthroughs, but to see that it's possible to get there. And so once you've got that kind of story, you can walk into that story now and it becomes a touchstone for you. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that concept. That's so helpful. Well, listen, I really appreciate you being on the show with me today. You have a book, right?
We have a new book. It just come out, A Story Intelligence. It's available on Amazon, and you can get the paperback, the Audible version, or the Kindle version. So they're all there. It's Story Intelligence. You can find it there. If you just put Richard Stone Story Intelligence, you'll get there. And it just launched this week.
Well, I'm going to help you out. I'm going to put a link in the description to your book so they can find it just with a quick click. It'll
That
be in
would
the
be great.
description or in the show notes.
Thank you so much for that, Ken. That's terrific.
Okay, well, you're quite welcome. I've really enjoyed our conversation today. And maybe when you have another book or we have another opportunity, we can talk more about this because I love the concept of story intelligence. You know, like I said, I'm a storyteller. I think that helps people grasp concepts they might not grasp otherwise. So I really enjoyed our conversation today.
Well, thank you for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
Okay. And again, for those that are watching or listening, if you haven't either followed me or subscribed, please do so. If you're watching on YouTube, please hit the like button because that lets YouTube know there's content that's worth sharing and they'll let more people see it. Also, if you have any questions, put them in the comments and I'll get in touch with Richard and we'll get answers. And we'll see you next time.